think many of you know that the Riley Institute actually has 3 centers. We do a number of things. We have one center which deals with diversity strategies around the whole state of South Carolina. Another one which deals with education policy and leadership in South Carolina and beyond. But what brings us here tonight is not one of those 2 centers, it's our other one, our center on critical issues, and certainly the incredible wealth gap, the widening of the wealth gap is a critical issue that affects everybody, not only here in this country, but across the whole world. Thanks for being here to listen about this, because I think you're going to find it extremely interesting. We're hosting a special guest, Dr. Nick Galasso, and he's here for an entire week. We bring Woodrow Wilson visiting fellows that stay a whole week. They interact with students and with faculty and with the community. Some of you, I think, have already been able to enjoy him in a class, or have had, some of the students have had breakfast with him or in small groups. And what we're hearing, the feedback is that he's one of the most incredibly personable people, and we know that he's extremely intelligent. He is our 18th Woodrow Wilson Visiting Fellow. The Woodrow Wilson Visiting Fellows program is sponsored by the Council of Independent Colleges in D.C. It brings prominent journalists and diplomats and other leaders to college campuses to engage in substantive dialogue with faculty and with students and with community leaders. We've had a large number of them, really impressive people. Previous Woodrow Wilsons who have visited Furman include former New Hampshire Governor and EPA head Christine Todd Whitman, former Maine Governor John Baldacci, U.S. Ambassadors Tom Boyett, Robin Sanders, and most recently, and some of you remember this, leading pollster in the country and public opinion expert Peter Hart. Here this evening to introduce properly our speaker is our interim dean of the faculty and John D. Hollingsworth Professor of Economics, Dr. Ken Peterson. Dr. Peterson was chair of the Department of Economics for 12 years. He's been honored for his outstanding teaching and his mentoring programs. I actually feel quite privileged to call him a colleague and a friend, and I feel privileged to be able to invite him here to introduce our speaker. Thanks.
How's everybody tonight? So I have a quick poll question. This is polling season, right? So we might as well take a quick poll. How many of you have heard of Oxfam before? Okay, so not everybody. Let me take just a minute and talk about Oxfam, and then we'll get to the business at hand, which is to introduce our special guest, Nick Galasso, who's from Oxfam. 1942, a group of Quaker intellectuals, social activists, and Oxford academics formed the Oxford Committee for Famine Relief in response to the plight of refugees in Greece. So this is Europe in the 1940s. And it was a pretty tough place, and people recognized that there were others who were suffering, and they got together to see if they could do something about that. After the war, the organization became known as Oxfam, based on the postal code in which the organization sat. It's funny how names come about. They continued to support people who were suffering throughout Europe. As Europe recovered, Oxfam turned its attention to people who lived in developing countries and who were suffering from hunger and other maladies related to poverty. In 1970, Oxfam America was founded to address the humanitarian crisis in Bangladesh related to its independence. And Oxfam America endeavors to right the wrongs of poverty, hunger, and injustice. So Oxfam is an organization that from its very beginning was a gathering of people who observed that others were in need, and it got together to figure out what they could do about that. We're really, really happy to have with us tonight Nick Galasso. Nick Galasso joined Oxfam America in 2012, serving first as American Council of Learned Societies Public Fellow and now as Senior Researcher. He leads Oxfam's work on economic inequality and focuses on the intersection of elites, extreme wealth, and political capture. Nick's research gained attention in 2014 with a calculation that indicated that the richest 85 people possess the same amount of wealth as the poorest half of the world's population. And you heard that right. The richest 85 people possess the same amount of wealth as the poorest half of the world's population. As a leading voice on inequality, he's a regular media guest for programs on Fox Business News, Al Jazeera America, ABC, CBS, Voice of America, Open Media Boston, and NPR stations across the United States. Prior to working for Oxfam, Nick taught international relations and political economy at Chestnut Hill College and the University of Delaware. His research has been published in the journals Global Policy and Foreign Policy Analysis, and he regularly writes for Oxfam's Politics of Poverty blog. Nick earned a PhD in global governance and lives in Washington, D.C., and we couldn't be happier to host him here at Furman University tonight. So please join me in welcoming Nick Galasso. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me here this week. It's a real honor and a real privilege. I want to thank the Riley Institute for this invitation. I really want to thank Jill, wherever she is, Jill Fusen, for all the work that she's done and all the work that the staff at the Riley Institute has done to make this visit just a real special opportunity for me. I also want to thank the faculty that have allowed me to interrupt their courses this week and meet their students and talk about the issue of economic inequality. And I want to thank the students for driving me around, showing me campus, having meals with me, and just being fantastic. It's been a real delight, and my heart is really warmed to be here. Let's see. Before we get started, I just want to technical. Okay, here we go. I just want to show you this picture real quick. We don't actually have a lot of great images of what inequality looks like, but I think that in a lot of ways this picture helps to give us a sense. This is a picture of a community in Brazil, and you can really see the dividing line between rich and poor, right here between this favela on the left and this very posh condominiums, I guess, or just really nice living quarters here on the right, just in its shadow. These little blue spots here, those are pools. Pretty fancy. I've never seen that before, but so I just thought that was just an interesting way to give you a sense of wealth inequality is in a lot of ways in people's faces. It's a real issue that we see not only in the United States, but particularly in developing countries around the world. I was born in the United States, but I wanted to start tonight by telling you about my family's immigration story. Our story is a familiar one of an immigrant family that came to the U.S. looking for a better life and higher standards of living. My family hails from a small village in a rural part of southern Italy that's very beautiful, but very economically challenged. When my father was born in the decade after World War II, much of the country still showed the scars of occupation and war. My grandmother saw her sister blown apart by a grenade right in front of her eyes during the war. And I was told stories about how families had to hide their daughters because the threat of rape by foreign soldiers was a real threat. In those post-war years, Italy had not one but two communist parties. And the country itself could be characterized by a richer, more prosperous, and better governed northern part, and a poorer, more backward agrarian south that was under the grip of gangs. In the South, where my family is from, it also suffered from very low levels of social trust among people who were not related. So people were highly suspicious of one another. And unfortunately, many of these distinctions between North and South and levels of social trust remain in the country today. My grandfather hated Italy. He was entrepreneurial. He wanted to get ahead. He wanted to make money. He wanted a higher standard of living for himself and for his family and do better than his forebears, who were all basically poor farmers. I know at one point he was driving a taxi to try to make some extra money. He tried to go into business with his own father, which didn't really work because he thought his father was just too backwards thinking. Eventually, my granddad, he left Italy in pursuit of a better life. First, he moved his young family that included my grandmother, my dad, and my dad's two sisters to Belgium, where he worked in the mines. He worked as a miner for a few years and then came back to Italy. Back in Italy, he saved his money, and as soon as he could, he boarded a boat and made the longest journey of his life, crossing the Atlantic to come here to the United States. He came alone. He left his wife, he left his kids, he left all the family and friends that he knew. Sorry. He left everything that he knew, right? When he got here, he didn't speak the language, he didn't speak a word of English, he knew maybe one or two other expats that had come before him. I often wonder what that experience was like. In many ways, it's a brave journey, but I'm sure that it was incredibly lonely, frightening, and certainly a difficult experience. And while his experience isn't unique, right? Tens of thousands of individuals left everything behind to come and make the long journey to the United States in the late 19th century and throughout the 20th century, many times alone, just like my grandfather did. But I'm sure that I don't think I could have done that. My dad, his sisters, and my grandmother, they didn't see him for 6 years when my grandfather finally asked them to join him and come over. In many ways, my grandfather, who died last year, so I actually had the opportunity to really know him well, he loved the United States. Despite being a poor migrant with hardly any education who couldn't speak the language, he succeeded here. The U.S. offered opportunity to someone who had vision, a certain tolerance for risk, a strong work ethic, and some street smarts. He really knew how to make $1 and turn it into $2. My grandfather came to own a gas station. He had an array of other commercial enterprises, and about the middle of the 1970s, he owned one of the largest car dealerships in Wilmington, Delaware, which is where I grew up. My dad came to the U.S. in 1965, also unable to speak English, and he faced the myriad challenges of being a 12-year-old kid who never saw big buildings before, never saw urban blight before. He never saw a person of a different race before. And now he found himself enrolled in a very tough public school in the gritty streets of South Philadelphia. He told me once that when they first arrived to the U.S., they were so poor that he had to steal a bicycle to ride to school, which is something that he's still very ashamed about. But my dad did fine. He learned English. He worked for my grandfather. He went on, started his own businesses. He got married. He had 3 kids. And with my mom, he was able to give my brothers and I a very securely middle-class life where we've all gone on to have careers in our own families. And though they had no clue what I was doing in graduate school for so many years, as immigrants, my dad and my grandparents were very proud that I not only was the first person in our family to go to college, but that I eventually went on to earn a PhD, which may sound trivial to you all, but it was something that was completely out of reach for someone in my family just a generation ago. So why am I telling you my family's coming to America story? Because a lot of what my family experienced is extremely relevant to the economic inequality crisis that we see in so many countries around the world today. Let's first talk about geography. I'm sure you've heard the phrase, the lottery of life. It refers to the circumstances that we're born into that are out of our control. Without a doubt, there is a lottery of life that has to do with where and to whom you're born. It's a lottery because it boils down to chance, really. You can't scream from the womb that you want to be born to rich parents in a nice Parisian suburb instead of being born to poor parents in an impoverished American city or a rural village in Africa. To put it differently, by simply being born in a rich country like the United States, the odds that you will be comparatively richer than most people on the planet is essentially a given. So I'm a political economist, so I can't get away with talking without charts. So, and for some of the students in the courses that I visited today and yesterday, I apologize, you might see some of the same charts again. But if you look behind me here, this is a chart. It looks at 5 countries, the US, Russia, Brazil, China, and India. And what these lines represent for each of the countries, it's essentially what their income distribution looks like from poorest to wealthiest, left to right. And what we're basically seeing is how those folks in these countries line up in the global income distribution. We don't have to get too much into the nitty-gritty, but what I want you to observe in this chart is that the poorest Americans essentially have the same incomes and living standards of the richest Indians, and certainly in large swaths of the richest Chinese, right? So it kind of gives us that comparative sense that where you're born, even if it is at the bottom in a rich country like the United States, you are in effect have certain advantages that perhaps other people on the planet don't. So let's think about this. In many respects, you are richer than most people on the planet, not because you work harder or are smarter or more talented, but simply because you were born or live in the wealthiest society ever known. Of course, I'm sure that all of you work hard. I'm sure that all of you are smart, and I'm sure that all of you students here tonight are discovering your unique talents. And there's absolutely no substitute for smarts and hard work. My point is that being born in a rich society places you at a higher starting point than many others on the planet. As I said, my family made the long and treacherous journey to come to the United States to overcome that lottery of birth and geography. Italy was war-torn. It was poor. It had little opportunities for people to advance. The US was prosperous. It was well-governed, and it offered greater opportunities. I think that we should consider the accident of geography and the luck of being born or living in a rich country when we debate and think about issues like immigration today. You pop on the news, it isn't difficult to see gripping images or learn horrible stories of migrants from places like in North Africa that have drowned just trying to cross the Mediterranean Sea in pursuit of many of the same things that my family and probably many of your families were looking for generations ago. The same is true of refugees looking for peace and prosperity for their families who are fleeing violence in conflict-stricken places like Syria, South Sudan, and other places of violence. Okay, second, let me introduce a wonky phrase called intergenerational mobility. This is a concept that refers to the probability that the income someone earns is tied to the income of their parents. In many respects, this is the concept of the American dream, right? The way I understand the American dream, our ability to become economically successful isn't tied to where and to whom we come from. It isn't determined by how rich or poor our parents are, but rather our ability to work hard and get the things that we want. Right? The American dream is that ideal that we can have a better standard of living than those before us, our parents and our grandparents and the like. It also means that those that are born with a silver spoon in their mouth may fall from high up if they make the wrong choices in life, right? So it's the idea that our futures are not preordained by where we come from. This idea is certainly related to this concept of geography that I just spoke about. So my granddad, right, he came to the US to ensure that his kids had a better way of life than he had growing up. My parents worked hard to make sure my brothers and I could have the same. In the American experience, the American dream is about passing on these greater advantages to our kids than we had. But we have to ask, is the American dream dead today? Will your generation fare better than generations before you? Is in fact the American dream just that? Is it just a dream? It turns out that there is a very strong connection between economic inequality and the likelihood that a child's future income is tied to that of their parents, or that wonky phrase I use, intergenerational mobility. Now, I know that most of you are not economists or statisticians, but what I want to do tonight, I'm going to show you a series of slides that look like this. It's called a scatter plot. And what it does is it shows correlations, associations, relationships between two concepts. On all of these charts, on the bottom horizontal axis, is economic inequality, and it goes from not so bad to pretty bad, left to right. On the vertical axis, going up, I'm going to show you a range of social problems. And what we see through these charts is that there is a strong relationship that as inequality goes up, a range of social ills and social problems become worse. This chart is sometimes called the Great Gatsby chart. Perhaps you read the Great Gatsby in high school or maybe here at Furman, right? And what this basically is telling us is that as countries, as societies become more unequal, the likelihood that your income will be tied to your parents goes up. So it's sort of the antithesis of the American dream. It's the idea that inequality can actually undermine that notion of the American dream. The last concept that I want to relay regarding my family's immigration story is the idea of social trust, which refers to the faith that we have in the people around us, like those in our community or other Americans. Do we find them to be reliable? Do we think that they have integrity? Are they people that you can count on? Are they honest? Social trust is paramount in a democracy. We need to have faith in our leaders that they're doing what's right for the public. We need to trust our fellow citizens that they're doing the same, especially if they're in positions of power, like if they're running big banks or if they're leading our religious and faith communities. As I mentioned earlier, the Italy that my family left a few decades ago had very low levels of social trust. In fact, it still does. And this stymies progress in terms of delivering better governance outcomes for citizens and building a strong sense of community. Unfortunately, there's also a strong relationship between inequality and social trust. So we find that as countries are more equal, we gain a greater sense of community, a greater sense of faith in our fellow citizens and the like. In fact, as I previewed, there are a lot of connections between economic inequality and a range of social ills that threaten our communities, our country, and even our capacity to experience happiness. I'm going to run through these a little bit. I hope I'm not in the way. I hope you can see them. But what we see that mental illness is higher in more unequal societies. And I hope that you can try to find the United States as I go through these. It tends to be pretty bad. The US is the most unequal rich country in the world. We find that drug use is more common in more unequal countries. So again, you can see the US not in a great position here. High inequality, high levels of drug use. We find that people live longer in more equal societies. We find that infants die at a higher rate in more unequal societies. We even find that we find higher instances of obesity in more unequal societies. We find that educational scores are higher in more equal places around the world. You looking for the US? We bring it down a little bit and look at US states. We see that more children drop out of high school in more unequal US states. Can you find South Carolina? Sort of dangerously in the higher middle part of that graph. Let's see if I can. We see that teenage pregnancies are higher in more unequal societies. Again, look at the US. If we look at US states, we see a similar phenomena. South Carolina. We see that homicide is more prevalent in more unequal societies. You can see the US as sort of the outlier there. We look at US states, we see the same phenomena. We see homicide rates are higher in more unequal states. South Carolina. We find that children experience conflict more regularly in unequal societies. We find that countries that are more unequal lock up more of their citizens. And we see the same phenomena in the US, where US states, the more unequal a US state is, the more likely they are to lock up more of their citizens. So why did I show you all these slides? Not to depress you. I showed you these slides to demonstrate that economic inequality is bad for humanity. We shouldn't work on it only because we have a moral or ethical commitment or outrage. I mean, I hope that you are moved in that way in an ethical sense. But I want you to understand that high levels of inequality matter for all of us because they damage our societies. And those at the top of the economic ladder in high inequality countries are not immune to the negative effects. For instance, those negative health outcomes that I showed you that are more prevalent in high inequality societies certainly affect everyone in society. And as someone who travels often to high inequality countries, please take my word for it. You don't want the United States to become like those places, where crime is higher, where those with a little bit of wealth have to live behind gates, behind barbed wires with hired security. We also know that high rates of economic inequality can actually infuse volatility into our economy. So research from the International Monetary Fund, from Standard & Poor's, neither of which can really be labeled as liberal or progressive organizations, they've demonstrated that high inequality actually undermines the rate in which economies can grow. So if you care about the health of the economy and want to see it expand, then you also need to care about economic inequality. So how bad is economic inequality? Well, let me tell you, the world today is exceptionally unequal. Globally, inequality among all the people on the planet is exceptionally high, and it's been on the rise. So let me give you some figures. Dr. Peterson noted some of my research where a colleague and I calculated that 85 people had the same amount of wealth as the bottom half of the human population, which is incredible, right? It's very hard to wrap your head around, 85 billionaires. We've updated this calculation over the last 2 years. And when we did it in 2015, the number shrank to 80 people. And when we did it in January of this year, the number shrank even more to 62 people. So wealth is concentrating at a greater rate among fewer and fewer and fewer people at the very, very top. If we expand that lens a little bit and look at the richest 1% on the planet, today, the richest 1% own more than half of all the world's wealth. We expand it a little bit more and look at the richest 10%. The richest 10% own 86% of all the world's wealth. Now, I was talking with some students today in Professor Smith's class, and I asked them, I said, how much do you think it takes to be in the richest 10%? Does anybody want to take a guess who wasn't in that class today? How much wealth do you need to be in the richest 10% in the planet? No wrong answers. $2 billion. Anybody else? How much? $100,000. I said this, I feel like I'm on The Price is Right. To be in the richest 10% club, you need wealth, right? Wealth, not income. So stocks, bonds, your car, what you own of your house, your retirement account, savings account, that kind of thing, of $75,000, right? Is that a lot of money? To be in the richest 1% on the planet, you need to have, well, anybody want to guess? How much wealth would it take to be in the 1% club? How much? 250,000? Other guesses? That sounds low, right? You need $750,000 in wealth, so less than $1 million. which, I think sounds like a lot, but is it really a lot? Is it a crazy amount of money? Sorry, I keep walking away from the mic. To be in the richest half of the planet. So let's imagine we take all 7 billion of us and we divide into two groups. What do you think is the entry cost to be in the richer half? How much wealth do you think you need to be in the richest 50%? Come on. Who said that? Really good. You need $4,000. $4,000. And so I was talking to students today. Is that a lot of money? Not really. So maybe you own I know you're college students and, may not have a big income right now, but maybe you have a car that's worth $4,000. Or maybe you have a car that's worth less, but you have some bonds, or, it's easy to kind of cobble that much together. So that just gives you a sense of what wealth inequality looks like around the world. It's highly, highly, highly stratified and unequal. Let's look at the United States real quick. So I have two charts up here. We're going to start with the one in the top left. So we're going to stick with wealth. We're talking about wealth. As of 2012, as the graph indicates, the richest 1% of Americans own 35% of all the country's wealth. The richest 10% of Americans own 76% of all the country's wealth. The richest 20% of Americans own 90% of all the country's wealth. This means that the poorest 80% of Americans, between them, own about 10 to 11% of all the wealth in the United States. And the bottom 40%, they have no wealth at all. Now, let's be fair. Some of you in this room are in that bottom 40% because you may have student loans, right? You have more debts than you have assets. So maybe you won't stay in that bottom 40% your whole life, or if you own a home and you have more debt than you have equity in that house. But it's still, I think, is quite striking the way that wealth inequality is so concentrated in the U.S. If you look at the bottom right here, now let's look at household income and how that's changed. I was telling students today, I get pretty excited about some of this data. I'm a geek, self-admitted geek and nerd, but this is new data that comes from the census. And what it shows us here is how household income has changed since 1967. So looking really at the last 50 years of what's happened in the United States. And what this bottom right chart is doing is it's taking the US population, right, and it's kind of looking at different slices of where people fall in the population. And what we can see here is that if you are in the richest 95th percentile, those households have seen in 2015 dollars nearly $100,000 increase in their household income, from about $118,000 to about $215,000. So that's incredible growth for families that occupy that upper echelon. But if you look lower down in the distribution, it's a much flatter story. So if you look right in the middle, if you look at the 50th percentile, you see those families have really seen only about a $10,000 increase in their household income since the mid-'60s. If you look at the poorest 20%, it's even more depressing, I would say, where you've seen really about a $4,000 increase in the households of those that occupy the 20th percentile, which is pretty low. What does this tell us? In this period, we've seen the U.S. economy grow. We've seen the stock market be on fire at different episodes. We've seen corporate profits on the rise. We've seen productivity grow. What it tells us is that the gains of that growth have really benefited those at the top and not so much everyone else. Okay. I want to bring up something that I think can be a little bit uncomfortable for people. This is the topic of privilege. In many ways, I don't think that we can have an honest conversation about economic inequality without acknowledging that some of us are born or enjoy certain privileges that others do not. And that these privileges can be a wedge that differentiates us economically and socially and contributes to economic inequality. Privilege goes hand in hand with this idea of the lottery of where one is born, and especially to whom you're born. It also includes being born not only to parents that have sufficient economic resources to take care of you, but they're also great parents, right? They give us love, they give us confidence. Likewise, privilege may be being raised in an environment that's free of drug or physical abuse and in a community that supports us. In addition to these, society has constructed other characteristics as privileges that are bequeathed to us by the lottery of life. For instance, the color of our skin is a construction of privilege. So is sex, as we know that men make higher wages than women do, often for doing the same job. So I ask that you think about the circumstances that you grew up with that may have given you an advantage over others. How were or are you privileged? About 3 weeks ago, I was invited to Hope College for their annual Critical Issues Symposium. This year, the symposium looked at economic inequality and democracy. Hope is it's a small private college in Michigan. It's about 86% white, costs about $45,000 a year to attend. I had a lunchtime discussion with a bunch of students, and there was one student, a guy named Derek, who's a student of color. He grew up in the wealthy suburbs of Orange County, California. He raised his hand and began to give this really open and honest and brave reflection on his own privilege that he experienced in his life. He said that he was lucky because in high school, he didn't have to work. All he had to do was study and play sports. He also acknowledged how lucky he was that every year, his parents really just write a check for tuition. He doesn't have to work while he's at Hope. That covers all of his expenses and everything like that. And that his dad has already committed to paying for law school for when Derek graduates from Hope. So Derek, in a lot of ways, has a significant leg up on many of his contemporaries around the country. And he was brave enough to talk about it openly and acknowledge it. The point that he was trying to convey to everyone in that room was that those with privilege shouldn't be ashamed of it. It's not something that we necessarily get to decide. Too often, what I find is that people that want to fight the injustices of poverty and inequality, who come from more advantaged backgrounds, tend to play down their privileges, so to seem maybe more authentic or to be able to connect with those who come from tougher backgrounds. And I think that this can do more harm than it can do good. Being truthful, being open, being reflective on the privileges that we are fortunate to have can be a building block towards greater empathy for those who grew up with less advantages. So I think a real inventory of one's privileges can push us towards realizing what are the key factors that every kid needs to succeed. And if we come to realize that those inequalities of the lottery of life are driving the inequalities of income and wealth that we see, and I think that we as a society have a moral duty to rectify those inequalities that derive from the lottery of life. But we may not be able to identify them without individual and personal accounting of our own advantages. And this isn't a message only for those here that were born and raised in wealthier households. I'm sure that those among us who were raised in households with tighter budgets can identify certain privileges and advantages that they were fortunate to have that maybe other kids didn't have, and that made a difference in their life. My parents didn't go to college, and they certainly weren't wealthy. But they gave me a very solid middle-class upbringing in a neighborhood that was safe to play in. They supported my interests, and they pushed me to get an education beyond high school, which was actually difficult because I wasn't really interested in school. I count all of these things as advantages. And these things made an enormous difference in what I've been able to do with my life. Often, people say to me, they say, Nick, you do a good job of describing the problem of inequality, of making us depressed, right? And the extent and the consequences of inequality. But the next question you can probably guess is that people ask me is, what do we do about it? What are the solutions to this grave problem? I hate to disappoint you, but I'm often sort of coy in my response. This is because, in many ways, the solutions to reducing extreme economic inequality, are not necessarily rocket science. Rather, it's the politics that are the monumental obstacle to the types of changes that we want to see. Now, I'm joking slightly because in certain contexts around the world, solving the problem of inequality is definitely harder than just getting political agreement among different actors in society, decision makers, and elites, right? But still, the fundamentals remain pretty basic. If you want to reduce inequality, then you need to increase the wealth and the incomes of low and middle income groups, families, faster than the richest groups. This is what occurred in the United States in the decades after World War II that created the strong and secure middle class that defined the United States in the 50s, 60s, and the 1970s. So how can a country do this? How can a country achieve this? Again, I don't mean to be coy, but I would urge that this is what you should be telling your elected officials to devote their energies to figuring out. This is the problem that you should put to them. Now, some mechanisms that can lift the incomes of low and middle income groups faster than the rich likely include some combination of raising the minimum wage or establishing a living wage for workers at the bottom. It can be about creating incentives in how technologies change so that they actually are job creating instead of job destroying. It could be working towards full employment during economic downturns through things that we saw during the New Deal, like the Works Progress Administration. In the US, we can return to a higher top marginal income tax rate like we had for most of the post-World War II years. We can evaluate if the inheritance tax in the US, the tax that's paid when you die and you leave your wealth to your heirs, should that apply to smaller fortunes than it does now to prevent the creation of class dynasties in the US? Right now, the estate tax only applies to fortunes of $5.4 million or more. What that means is it only applies to, you hear a lot about it, people call it the death tax and it's this scourge and this, that, and the other. It only applies to 0.2% of American families, so it's quite small. Likewise, we could increase taxes on sources of income that are relied on by more wealthy folks, such as taxes on capital assets, which are taxed at a lower rate than income. And perhaps you've heard Warren Buffett often say that he pays, he's a billionaire, he pays a lower rate of tax than his secretary because he's taxed on his wealth, his capital, which is taxed at a lower rate. She's taxed on her income, so she's actually taxed at a higher rate, which I think sounds kind of crazy. We can close loopholes that permit corporations to stash approximately $2.5 trillion in offshore tax havens. Donald Trump tells us that this figure is actually much, much higher. All of these mechanisms may reduce economic inequality. But for me, greater tax revenue doesn't mean much unless it's reinvested into increasing the chances of poor kids to get ahead and escape the lottery of life. In developing countries, we might see a different range of solutions. It's probably, it's important to get tax rates so it's progressive as incomes and wealth go higher, but it's also making sure that we cover the basics, making sure that kids have access to quality schools and healthcare and skills training and the like. I, along with some others, often say that inequality is a choice. I just want to say a little bit about what this means. So far, I've talked about economic inequality, but to really understand what's been going on in the United States and elsewhere, we have to understand political inequality. Franklin Delano Roosevelt once said, "We are political equals when inside the polling booth, every American man and woman stands as the equal of every other American man and woman. There they have no superiors. There they have no masters save their own minds and their conscience." Political equality means citizens exercise the same amount of political power to influence government and society, regardless of their wealth and their position. It's akin to the phrase of one person, one vote. Today, money has become the great political unequalizer that's threatening the ideal of what democracy means in the United States. Capitalism produces winners and losers, and what we've been seeing is the winners translating their wealth into political power through campaign contributions and through lobbying. Now, there are important differences between our two main political parties in the United States, but what they share in common is that they both cater to wealthy individuals and to big corporate interests who seek to control the choices of elected officials so that public policies enrich their bottom line with the help of the state. This is done through tax loopholes. It's done through subsidies to particular corporations. It's done through deregulation that may favor the wealthy and big corporations at the expense of all of us. For instance, we can argue that, or many argue that we can't afford free college, that we can't afford universal health care. Yet, as I said, the way the tax laws are written in the United States, it legally allows corporations to stash over $2.5 trillion offshore to avoid about $700 billion in taxes. So make no mistake, this is the welfare that we should be up in arms about. Sadly, what I'm telling you probably isn't news to you. In a recent poll, 71% of Americans across lines of ethnicity, class, race, age, and gender say they believe the economy is rigged. People report that they are working harder for financial security today. 1/4 of the respondents had not taken a vacation in more than 5 years. 71% said they're afraid of unexpected medical bills. 53% said they feared not being able to make a mortgage payment. And among renters, 60% worried that they might not be able to make rent. Yet between 2009 and 2013, as the economy recovered from the financial crisis, the richest 1% captured 85% of all the income growth. So something is out of sorts. I want to leave you with some thoughts on the kind of leaders I think America needs to reverse the scourge of rising income, wealth, and political inequality. I think that we need leaders that have a sober understanding that unfettered wealth can undermine our democracy, and that money is not the same thing as speech. We need leaders who recognize the unique moment that in history that we're living in, that the United States is at very much a tipping point where our current model of wealth-driven, winner-takes-all politics is eroding our democratic institutions. We need leaders aware of the growing discontent among most Americans, many of whom think the system is rigged against them, in favor of the rich. We need leaders who understand that the current system is undermining the American dream and weakening the U.S.'s stature as a land of opportunity despite one's background. We need leaders who recognize the urgency of this moment, where the naked corruption of our democracy by a wealthy elite adds to the public's distrust in government. We need leaders who understand that wealth transmits privileges across generations that entrench inequality if society doesn't intervene. Regardless of where you end up, I hope that you'll become the kind of leader that can exercise empathy for those that are more disadvantaged than you. I hope that you'll become the kind of leader that influences change towards greater equality wherever you have the capacity. And I hope that you'll be brave enough to participate in restoring a more economically prosperous country for all of its citizens by challenging the rules that make it work best for only the wealthiest. Thank you very much.
We have time for about 2 or 3 questions. So who would like to go first? And we have some microphones mobile here. Got one back here in the center.
Thank you. That was a pleasure and extraordinarily informative. And I'm going to be brave and ask the first questions. I have a specific question related to increasing the minimum wage, and if you have comments concerning the argument that that will be an undue hardship on small business and that will not realize the expected returns that we will have by giving it? And the other, is there somewhere that we can go to access some of the data that you presented tonight?
You want me to respond, or do you want?
Go ahead.
Thank you very much for being brave enough to ask the first question. Yeah, and thanks for asking a really, really hard question about the minimum wage. And you know, this is something that is certainly contentious. We see data that supports both sides of the argument that it could, in fact, hurt small businesses. I think that the best, most compelling data that I've come across, the best research that I've come across, comes from the Congressional Budget Office, which is an independent research arm of the federal government that essentially assesses the, you know, what different types of, how different types of policies may impact us economically. And what the data really tells us is that, yeah, there will be some harm to small businesses, but on the whole, the benefits outweigh the costs of raising the minimum wage. I think we should think about how paltry the federal minimum wage is right now, particularly in terms of the cost of living and what it takes to raise a family, for example. In terms of the data that I've used here tonight, most of those slides that I showed you that, as this woman said, is quite depressed, that I showed to depress you, that data comes from two British social scientists who published a fabulous book a couple years ago called The Spirit Level. Their names are Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett. And essentially that book is just it's just a series of all of these relationships between inequality and a whole host of social ills. They've spent decades studying the consequences. Some of those relationships are stronger than others. The ones that show that inequality harms health are really robust and really strong. So you can find that data there. I'm trying to think what else I showed you just real quick. I think that would, yeah. So that's the spirit level stuff. If you want to get into the nitty gritty of this data, there's the Economic Policy Institute, which is a great source of American inequality and how it's changed over the last few decades. If you are really brave and want to look at some papers written by smart economists, you can look at the work that's been done by the International Monetary Fund that shows the relationship between inequality and growth. They also have robust data showing that actually redistribution, which tends to be a dirty word in American politics, actually doesn't undermine growth. So those are great places. The World Bank is also a good place if you're interested in looking at inequality and poverty outside of the United States, developing countries.
Okay, time for one more question. Right here.
So I hear a lot of like the national deficit being a problem from members of the right. And I was wondering, you know, Robert Reich argues that the national deficit is meaningless in terms of the percentage of the GDP. And so long as yearly deficit goes down, in terms of that it's okay. Could you elaborate on that and explain, like, should we be concerned about the national deficit, or is it something that we can handle later on?
It's really not an area where I feel comfortable speaking about. You know, my work is really looking at income and wealth distributions and not national accounts. So I can only speak as a layperson, really not as an expert. I tend to agree with Robert Reich and his assessment that we can take on more and more debt loads as long as the economy continues to grow. So I think it's really more focusing on that latter part of the equation of whether we are seeing sufficient economic growth.
That was a short one, so
Sorry,
we have time.
I'm just not an expert
we
on
have
the
time
data.
for one more. Okay, right here.
Parents coming from Italy and all that. Excuse me. Thank you. And so what I wanted to ask was about kind of how your political beliefs have changed as you've gone through college and then grad school with respect to growing up, and if it was kind of a different bent growing up, a shift, or like how has that changed for you? It's just my curiosity.
Thank you for asking a personal question. I think, you know, my parents are like not political at all. I did not grow up around a table where we talked about politics. My parents salt of the earth, fantastic, wonderful, great people, but just not political people. A lot of it, as I was telling other students, I grew up in a place where there was a lot of environmental racism, where there was I grew up in Delaware, which is a fiefdom of the DuPont Corporation, and so at a young age, I saw really the power of big business, of big corporate interests. I saw poor people having to carry the burden of chemicals being dumped unsafely, of people's voices really being silenced, and that turned me on as an individual. My parents say I'm adopted, so we're very different in a lot of ways. But that is what turned me on to politics at an early age. I don't think my political beliefs have changed that much, actually. I know maybe that's normal. We tend to have the beliefs of our parents, right? That's usually what happens. My parents didn't have any, so it's kind of a tabula rasa, if you will. So.
All right, well, please join me in thanking Nick Galasso one more time. Thank you. And I want to add my thanks to the folks at the Riley Institute for putting on a great program. Thanks very much. Appreciate it.